Welcome everyone to Drisha's full program, and this is the second out of our three-part series on virtual reality and genuine humanity. Can they coexist? This session considers Jewish law as it relates to virtual reality, and particularly to decisions rendered over the course of the pandemic. And with that, I'll turn it over to you, Rabbi Zuckier.
Hey, great. So I think for those of you who were here last time, you'll know that last time we discussed different issues pertaining, or different challenges pertaining to virtual reality, specifically of the Zoom type variety, where there's interaction between people or interaction between a person and what they see and hear, but it's not direct, it's not in person as much as it's virtually, right? There's a screen that's projecting visual data, and there's a speaker that's projecting audio data. And the question is, how does that work from halacha? And last time we discussed a variety of issues that come up in that context, and we focused on just a portion of history, of Jewish history, primarily all of Jewish history until the year 2020. So, but as we're going to find out today, there's a lot that's been said about this very issue just over the past months. As of course, because of the pandemic, a lot of things have moved online, and the questions that we're going to see, questions about davening, questions about saying various brachos, questions about various prohibitions relating to virtual interaction over Zoom and similar technologies is something that very much came to the fore this year. So last time we came up with four main categories that where we found there were different challenges for this category, for different challenges for the ability to do things online, reasons why there may be differences between interacting over, let's say, Zoom, over some virtual platform versus interacting physically. And I'm just going to put them in the chat. Give me a moment. The four are verification. How do you know for sure that that you're seeing or hearing? Verification. How do you know for sure that what you're perceiving on the other side is actually true, is accurate? Second is the idea of human connection. The fact that we're having a conversation right now or whatnot, is that the same as actually having an in-person connection? A third is presence. The idea of being in the same place. Can you qualify as having presence based on Zoom? And then the fourth category of the acts of seeing, hearing, and writing, does that really qualify as doing that over Zoom? So I just put them in the chat now. Again, verification. How do I know to believe that what appears to be happening on the other side of the screen is true? The idea of connection. Are we really experiencing each other or what's on the other side of the screen in the way that we would if we were physically in person? Presence. Is there we saw some areas of halacha require that there actually be presence, that people be present in the same place. And then the idea of seeing, hearing, writing, when done over a virtual medium, does it qualify or not? And so today, we're going to look at each of these categories, but we're going to look at how they've played out over the last 9 months or so. And some of the issues that we discussed last time are live issues now as well. Some of them a bit less so. Like last time we saw a couple of sources about Kiddush HaChodesh, how to decide when the new month is and how to sanctify the moon. So it used to be done al pi re'iyah. Witnesses would go, would see the moon, would go to the Sanhedrin or Yerushalayim and testify. Nowadays, obviously, we don't do it like that. So that specific question won't be relevant, but there are going to be other questions that have come up in recent months that will be relevant as well. So we're going to keep the same overall four categories, and we'll talk about some of the specific halachic questions that are sort of classical issues that have come up in the past, and we'll also look at some halachic issues that are relatively new. So I'm going to share my screen now, and we'll work through the handout together. Okay, let's go to the top. So, okay, so again, the first issue was verifiability. And last time we spent a fair amount of time on this question of the husband's directive to write a get. That, part of the requirements for a get is that the husband has to direct the sofer, the scribe, and the edim, the witnesses on the get to do those roles. They can't sort of just intuit it or indirectly hear. They need to hear directly from the husband. And the question is, can you do it over video conference? Can you do it over Zoom? So last time we saw this question goes back a while. Originally, the question was about, can you do it over the telephone or not? Many people said you could, some said you couldn't. So then the question was, well, now that we have video conferencing, about 20, 25 years ago, the question was raised, now that there are ways to do video conferencing, maybe that can become sort of standard. And Rabbi Jachter suggested that, and he got a lot of pushback. So in the end, he said, you know what, let's not make the standard. In some extenuating circumstances, we might be able to rely on this, but generally, we're not going to rely on video conferencing of the husband to direct the scribe, the sofer, and the witnesses, the aidim, to participate in the get, because we don't want to get into a dispute, we don't want to get into a machlokas about it. But in recent months, the last few months, I couldn't find this written anywhere, but people who work in and run the Beis Din told me this: the Beis Din of America's policy has shifted, where I think the overwhelming majority of the gittin that they did, certainly in the earlier stages of the pandemic, have been using this process. So instead of having the husband come into the Beis Din and tell the sofer to write it, etc., it would be done over a video conference, over Zoom. And last time we talked about how the halachic category there, it wasn't clear which of the four categories was relevant. Is it an issue of verification, which it likely is, according to many, according to Rav Moshe Feinstein, an issue of verification, or is it an issue of having some special connection, having the meeting of the minds between the husband and the sofer, or possibly you need to formally hear the statement from the husband. So in terms of verifiability, it seems to certainly solve the issue, and that's one development. Not a huge development, but something that was not a general policy, something that would only be done as necessary under extenuating circumstances, became the standard policy over the last few months. Fine, let's move now to the second category, this issue of human connection. And again, last time we talked about the brachos that one says upon seeing a friend, both Shechianu, if you haven't seen your friend in 30 days, and Baruch Mechayim Mesim, if you haven't seen your friend for 12 months. And the question was, do these apply if you see your friend over Zoom, or you see them on television, or if you talk to them on the phone? Those are some of the earlier discussions, but Zoom would be the same thing. And one of it seemed like the mainstream view we found is that saying Shechianu is really based on this special happiness you have when you meet your friend. And there was a dispute, there was a machlokas, but it seemed like the main view, based on what Rabbi Yosef said, the main view is that that doesn't qualify. The fact that you see your friend over Zoom or on the television doesn't qualify as making you happy enough to say a Shechianu. That's why probably most people haven't heard of this practice of saying Shechianu. It doesn't happen too much nowadays, although some people say it should happen more often than it does. But in any event, over Zoom would not qualify, because even though you're talking to each other, you don't have that same direct connection. So today we're going to look at a couple of issues that, not that same issue of Shechianu, but a couple of related issues that require somehow being present and having that special connection to the event. So this is not going to be about like just the fact of being present, but it's going to have something about the experience of being there, feeling that connection to the people involved or to the other parties involved, and you'll understand what I mean in a bit. And this we're going to look at now, a short tshuva by Rav Hershel Schachter of YU. We'll see several of them here today, because he's related to this issue of how virtual reality, how Zoom plays out in halacha many times over the past months. And he writes as follows. He's talking about a bris where a grandfather wants to say a few of the brachos, etc. We're going to skip that paragraph because it's not directly related to our issue. It's sort of a side issue. But then he talks about a shever brachos. So you have a shever brachos in one place with a minion there. You have the grandfather, the grandparent who's elsewhere and is participating by Zoom for whatever reason. You can't say one of the shever brachos in that case. You can't say a shever brachos virtually. This is a shayla that came up a lot. A lot of people had weddings with a minimal group of people. They had family members over Zoom. Can you have the family members say shever brachos over Zoom? Or Schachter, some people said yes. Schachter here says no. Why? Because in practice, he's not participating. Now, there's different ways of understanding this. You could say that this is really about, about the being present in some formal sense. I think most likely it's about the idea of happiness, of feeling the excitement. So that seems to be the most reasonable explanation here. So because you're not really there, shever brachos, it's supposed to be someone who's participating and feels that connection. So maybe you can't do it, according to Schachter, you can't do it if you're at a distance. So that's one tshuva. Again, you could look at it, you can understand it a couple different ways. The next one about Birkas Hailanos. is going to be even clearer. Birkei Lanos, the bracha said on newly blossoming fruits, usually said Nisan time during the early spring, or during the spring. And so the question is, what if you see the trees over Zoom? You're whatever reason, you're in a, you're living in New York City, there aren't too many trees, you're not going out too much, but you can see trees over Zoom. So what should you do? When you see things directly right in front of you, you have some special excitement, a degree of excitement. Either happiness or sadness in whatever experience. That's not the case if you see something not directly in front of your eyes, but over Zoom. Maybe you're more excited than if you just look at a picture, if you're looking at a live video. You don't have the same degree of excitement as if you actually see it. So if you're looking at a tree, a newly blossoming fruit tree, or just tree over Zoom, you're more excited than if you're just looking at a picture, but you're less excited than if you actually walked up to it in person. And therefore, quotes Rabbi Yosef, that should therefore be a suffix. It's not clear, it's a suffix, it's doubtful as to whether you have a sufficient degree of excitement to say the bracha on the trees. And in general, we have a real suffix bracha zahakel. If you're doubtful about whether to say a bracha or not, when in doubt, do without, and don't say the bracha on the fruit tree. And then he notes that Rabbi Yosef was talking not about Zoom, but about a live broadcast, very related to what we saw last week. Rabbi talking about live broadcasts on, you seeing your friend on a live broadcast, really a similar logic, right? That even though you're seeing something on video, it's not the same as seeing it in person live. And then Rabbi Shafter wants to extend this to something else, because really al pizem ekubal sheyos v'safek kriya lahakel. Similarly, we have an idea of suffix avelus. In terms of the laws of mourning, when in doubt, we are lenient. And there's an idea of mourning the destruction of the temple, destruction of the Beis HaMikdash, even nowadays. And that when one sees Yerushalayim or the Temple Mount or the Kosel, when one sees these places, one's supposed to tear kriya. One's supposed to tear their clothing in a sense of mourning. But he says, if you see the Kosel, the Kotel, through Zoom, even though you haven't seen it in a while, you haven't seen it for 30 days, you still don't do kriya. Why? Because the experience of seeing it over Zoom is not the same as the experience of seeing it directly. So again, that same idea, or at least it's a suffix. It's doubtful whether it's sufficient or not. And when in doubt, for Avelus and for Kriya, we are lenient. So in these two cases, both were really three, right? Sheva Brachos, Birkas Ailanos, and Avelus on the Kosel, seeing the Kosel, tearing Kriya. In all these cases, the logic is that because you're not seeing it in person, you're just seeing it over video, you don't have that same excitement or the same human connection, or I don't know, the human tree connection, as the case may be, or the connection to the Korban. You don't have that same level of emotional attachment, and therefore you wouldn't say these brachos that you usually do or tear kriya, because it raises a suffix, it raises a question, and when in doubt, suffix brachos l'hakel, do without. So that's as for this second category. Remember, the category of human connection. So again, there are a couple of different cases that came up in recent months. This tshuva was in Nisan. The new fruits are blossoming. This tshuva also in Nisan a couple of weeks later, the Sheva Brachos was in Nisan, or it was earlier in Nisan. In any event, there are reasons to distinguish between seeing something live and seeing something over Zoom because of the lower degree of human excitement. All right, we'll pause now. If there are any questions or comments, I'll take off the share. Oh, it looks like, okay. So I see a question regarding the get over Zoom. Did the RCA rely on a specific tshuva? So I don't think there was a new tshuva, at least I haven't seen it. As far as I understand, what they relied on was the previous writings, Rabbi Jacker's article that we looked at last time, where it seemed like there was a lot of posts from a lot of major decisors who were okay with it, some who weren't, and the sort of a compromise was, don't do this unless it's really extenuating circumstances. And I think the logic was, now, during the pandemic, we're sort of all in extenuating circumstances, especially a few months ago. Even now, for people, for many people, it doesn't make sense to expect people to come in person and do that. So there's more room for leniency. And I think also part of it was the quality of the technology. Even what was said when I heard a shir about this, what was said was that, even Skype, even other technologies, it would often fail, it would get fuzzy, it wasn't as good. Zoom, for whatever reason, is working well. as we all know, and maybe that was part of it too. You felt, some of the it was sort of more verifiable, more of a a serious form of communication, and they could rely on that. But I don't know if there was a new tshuva. I think it was sort of the old tshuva with a bit new with new circumstances, both in terms of a greater need and in terms of the technology getting better. Any other questions or thoughts? Okay, so again, so far we've looked at this question of are things verifiable over Zoom, and is there the same emotional connection over Zoom? And now we'll move on to the main topic today, and really, I think probably the biggest halachic question that came up once this pandemic started, which is the idea of how to form a minyan for prayer, for davening. Can you form a minyan one way or another? And we'll use this broadly. Form a minyan like the core group of 10, or join into that group and you have a minyan in person. Can someone join in as an additional person over Zoom, or even just to say Amen, or to say Kaddish, or all sorts of other things? So there's a lot of different variations here of the issue, and a huge discussion over it in many different circles in America and Israel, in different denominations. So we'll look at some of these materials. There's really, you can write entire books, and some people already have, about these issues, but we'll take a look at some of it, and again, try to figure out this question of to what degree interaction over Zoom, this virtual interaction, gives us presence, or we'll see other related categories that come in, but the primary question is presence. And as we saw last time, the requirement for a minyan is to have a quorum of 10 together. Generally, that's understood as together in the same room. Although we saw last time, and we're going to see this again, this idea of if the parties can see each other, that might also count. And the idea is once you have a quorum of 10, it seems others who are not in the same room can join in. Once you have that quorum, others can join in and be a part of the minyan as well. So that's the background from last time. And as we also saw last time, the idea is that God's presence, the Shekhinah, dwells in the presence of a minyan, of a quorum together. So we're talking here not just about human presence, but we're actually also talking about the divine presence that sort of follows it, right? If humans are together in a group, God's presence joins as well. So so let's jump back in. If there are no further questions, let's jump. Oh, I see. Why is a pidyon haben over Zoom permissible? Okay, it's a little off topic. We weren't going to get into that. I assume the idea would be that it's a business transaction, and if you can do, pidyon haben is you're redeeming the son. So to the extent you can do business transactions over Zoom, although the Mashiach, you probably need Mashiach in some sense. You need somehow to send the money over to the other party. But assuming you can do that, it should work. But that's a bit off topic. It's not really, I don't think that touches on our core issues, but the interesting question. Okay, so let's move on now. I'll jump back into the share screen, jump into the issue of minyan and how minyan might work, or more likely might not work in the context of Zoom. So I mentioned people have written a lot about issues of COVID and halacha and minyan. So there's a sefer called Haviani Chadarav. It's published a few months ago already. It was published in very, very quick order, dealing with the main halachic issues that emerged in, I guess, March, April, May, the early days of the pandemic. And there are two sections. One section is sort of giving a summary of the main issues. We're going to look at a section of that. And then there were, dozens and dozens of tshuvos from different rabbinic decisors, mostly from Israel, that they weighed in on all these issues. So we're going to look now at Tziruf Mispalim B'Mirpasos, right? The joining together to make a minyan of those who are praying on porches. This was what happened, especially in Haredi communities in Israel and Dati Leumi communities. It was fairly common that people would, for communities that lived in apartment buildings, people would join in a minyan on the porches. So you have these huge apartment buildings, let's say inhabited by hundreds of Haredi families, and everyone has a porch. Of course you have a porch, because how else do you build a sukkah? Right? So you need to have a porch, and everyone would go out on their porch and daven, and they join together with other people on other porches for their minyan. This was standard procedure in Israel. Many communities in America, in some places too, Brooklyn especially, fine. So let's look at some of these sources here. Of course, being on a porch, seeing other people is not the same as virtual reality, but we'll see, we'll get there eventually. So let's look at what the standard psak has been on these issues. So he writes, when you have 10 davening together, if you have a group of 10, you have a quorum together, someone else who sees them, he's not part of that group, but he can see the group, he counts as if he's joined the group, right? You can join, you can't be one of the core 10 from a distance, it sounds like, so far, but you can join in and be the +1 and participate. Even if they're in a different building. Still, if it's easy for you to go from where you are to join the minyan, you of course should under normal circumstances, right? All things equal, if there's a quorum, you're elsewhere, you can count, but better to join. If you can't see them, you can only hear them. Some say, yes, you can say amen, you can say yesh me'ar, you can answer all the things, but you're not really considered a part of that minyan. You're not really joining to that minyan. You're someone who's at a distance who can say amen, but you're not really a part of that minyan. Unless there's no physical way for you to get there, then maybe you will count it as a minyan. And some say that it seems to be the main view that, or at least an important view, that if you hear the community davening, even in a totally different building, you can't see them at all, that still counts as tfilas tzibur. You still count as joining that minyan. Okay, that's sort of background information, not specifically about a pandemic. But then he says, "V'lachein tov shebeminyane mirpasos bekama binyanim yetzu mikol binyan kama bnei mishpacha achas v'yamdu b'pesach binyan v'yasu kain bekama binyanim smuchim." Right, it's good for people to not just daven from inside, but to go outside and try to join together as a minyan on the different porches. Even there's a different distance between the porches. Since you're all in the same street, you're in the same building, you join together. You build your minyan, your core group in one place, and then others can join as well. And then there's a limitation on this idea of joining together from a distance. What's the limitation? There needs to be no disgustingness, and this means either something that smells bad, like let's say animal feces or whatnot, or avodah zara. That's generally the view. If there is something disgusting between the minyan and you at a distance, you can't. You're not really a part of the minyan. You don't answer to Baruch Hu, but you do answer Kaddish and Kedusha. It's sort of a lower stakes issue. Fine. And then it says, fine. It says you can answer Kaddish and Kedusha even if you davened already. Fine. So let's go a bit further, and we're going to get into more details on this arrangement that existed in many places where people were joining together across different porches. And again, he's categorized this. They're not all in one place, but they can see each other, right? The group can see each other. Let's say, 2 people on this porch, 2 people on that porch. They can all together. There's a minyan. They can all see each other. And remember what we discussed last time, that there's a view. There's a view that you need to be literally in the same room to count for a minyan, but there's also the view that we saw cited in the name of the Rashba, Roim elu es elu. If you have a group and some can see the others, they can see each other, then they join together for a minyan, even if they're not in the same room. That's what the Rashba suggested. And we saw the Mishnah Berurah seemed to allow for this. So let's look into how this played out in general and recently. Kasher kol asar roim zeh, all 10 can see each other. Ve'ein beineim kfish or rechov, a mafsik beineim. There's no road blocking between them. You can join them together from the fact they see each other and they can make a minyan. Some say you should never rely on seeing each other, and you should better daven at home. You need to actually be in the same room for it to count. The Mishnah Berurah that we saw last time is lenient. That's all true. That's 100 years ago and earlier. But now let's go to in practice. Practically, last few months. There's a whole dispute about how to apply this now. We should say now we can rely on this position. It's totally fine to join a minyan together, even at a distance. As long as you can see each other, you can join a minyan together. Some say all the prayers as you'd want. The footnote says that this is Hagon Rav Asher Weiss and Rav Dunner. So Rav Asher Weiss, major posek in Israel, and Rav Dunner, I think I was in touch with a relative of his about his psak at the time. In any event, the Rav Asher Weiss allows for normal davening. Some wrote that since there's a worry, there are some positions that say you can't actually join together if you're not in the same place. You should sort of minimize your risk and try to avoid as much as possible brachos that you only say with a minyan, and if there's actually no minyan, would be a bracha levatala, would be an unnecessary bracha. Therefore, you should skip chazaras hashatz. Chazaras hashatz, usually you would only do if there's a minyan, so it would be a bracha levatala, arguably. It would be a wasted bracha, or 19 wasted brachas if you did a chazaras hashatz if you didn't actually have a minyan. So better to skip it, do tefillah tzar, do heicha kedusha, as they say, and skip the chazaras hashatz, and then get around that. Oh, sheyasne hashatz sheyispal tefillas nedava. Rabbi Chazan say do this whole davening on condition. He says, I'm saying chazaras hashatz if there's a minyan. If it's not actually a minyan, then I'm just doing an extra davening. I think several poskim said to do that as well. Fine, and maybe on Shabbos you should skip it. So the point is there's a debate here. What to do? This played itself out in real time in Israel back in March, April, May. Which the question was, okay, we can we're all in our homes, we're not leaving, we're in our porches, we can see each other, we're not in person. So can we rely on the view that counts as a minyan, that counts as presence, or not? Should we be stringent and say, well, we're not sure, so we'll only say parts of the davening that we could do anyway, and we won't do things like chazaras hashatz, the repetition of the Shemona Esrei, where it would be a bracha levatala, it would be a wasted bracha otherwise. Fine, and then you note some people say actually it's better not to do these porch minyan and better to just daven at home by yourself, especially if you have better kavanah, you'll focus better in that case. And then there's a whole question as to what the qualifications are for roin elu as elu. Does everyone need to see everyone? Can part of each group see each group? Doesn't matter who's in which, how many groups there are. We're not going to get into all those details. But now we get to something very interesting and pertinent to, we're going to make it pertinent to our question of virtual seeing. So he says as follows: Im yesh kvish o ma'avar tziburi, if there's a road or a public passageway, or even a private road, a private pathway, bein ha'omdim b'mirpasos, that passes between the different porches, right? So for example, you have one porch on one side of the street, one porch on the other side of the street. Can you join your minyan together? You have a public street in between. Yesh omrim she'ena mitzdarfim la'asara. Some say that you can't join together for a minyan. He quotes, the Shulchan Aruch seems to say this in the context of benching, in the name of Rabbi Yonah, that you can't bench if you're joining together on two sides of a street. You can't make a minyan, we ate together and then they went across the street or whatever it is. You can't make your minyan together because the street separates between them. So some say that you can't. V'yesh omrim she'im amirpasos begova habatim me'al gova asara yichol litztarif af k'shederach mafsika. They said, well, let's think for a second. Right, we're talking about porches, so they're up in the air. They're presumably more than 10 tefachim. They're at least several feet up in the air. And we know that at least in terms of Shabbos, the way Shabbos works, the public domain for the purposes of Shabbos extends only 10 tefachim up in the air. Extends only 3 or 4 feet midoraisa. But above that area is not the public domain. That's some sort of middle domain, however exactly you understand it. So the point is, anything that's in the air, there's no blocking, and even though my porch is here, your porch is there, we can join together in a minyan across the street, because we're not really across the street is below, we're above, we're outside of the public domain, there's no public domain blocking between us, and we can therefore daven together. Now, in the footnote here, he quotes a whole interesting discussion, and it's a really interesting line. He says there's a view that says that should work, but only within limits. Meaning you can join together on two different sides of the street only as long as you're still in buildings that are on the same ground, right? You're in whatever floor of the building you're on, but essentially you're connected to the ground. They're connected to the ground. So you're connected to each other by the fact that you're on the same ground. But here he brings up a fascinating question. Aval im yamdu chamish behelicopter echad ve'umulam yamdu od chamish behelicopter acher. You have a scenario, you have 5 You have 5 people in a helicopter here, 5 people in a helicopter there. Roim elu es elu. They look out the window, they can see each other. Can they join together for a minyan? So he says, he quotes this opinion, there's no, they're not connected through the ground. They're not standing on the ground that then connects them. They're both in the air, both helicopters in the air. Then he says, maybe, this is a suggestion, this is a novel idea, says maybe seeing each other won't count. Fine, and then he wants to apply that to other things. But let's think for a second about the implications of this idea. Let's say one disagrees on this helicopter example. Right? This sounds like a new idea that a helicopter wouldn't count as roim elu es elu because there's no ground connecting. That's a new idea. That's not in any of the sources. That was a chiddush. So what if you reject that idea? What if you said that two groups of people in a helicopter who can see each other can count together for a minyan? What's the next step? What's the next step that one could take from there? And let's think about virtual reality for a second. So what about a situation like what we're doing right now? Well, not right now because not everyone has their camera on. But let's say you had many people coming together over Zoom, and they all turned their camera on. So we have two different things. We have two different questions here. Question number one is, does it count as roim elu es elu? Do we see each other or not? And we're going to get to that. That's category number 4, right? That's category number 4 of, is seeing over Zoom, does it count as seeing? Does hearing over Zoom count as hearing? Does writing over Zoom count as writing? That's an important question to ask. We're going to get to that question. But let's assume for the sake of argument that seeing over Zoom counts as seeing, that it counts as if we're seeing each other. Okay, so then, well, you have a group of people over Zoom. They can all see each other. So, and let's say you also hold the view that now has become pretty mainstream, that roim elu es elu, if a group of people, a quorum, can see each other, then they can count as a minyan, right? And they can form even the quorum of 10, right? Just like people on different porches can join together, or just like people in different helicopters can join together. So there's really no logical objection that one could raise, because what's the objection? The objection is that we're not connected physically, but according to that view, we just said that the helicopters would work. This should be no worse than helicopters. Now, admittedly, we are making a few assumptions. We're assuming, number one, that seeing over Zoom counts as seeing. That's by no means obvious. And we're assuming that the helicopter scenario would work, that you just need to see each other. You don't need any deeper connection, any connection over land. But at least in theory, I think, based on what's out there, what's been presented, there is a path, there is an argument to be made for joining for a core minyan over Zoom. Now we're going to see no one, certainly no one Orthodox, and even outside of Orthodoxy, no one, is arguing that this should be the case under normal circumstances. But it's just worth noting, as we think about, how the different halachic views out there apply, and how some become more prominent than others. I think what we're seeing is the potential, a potential move in that direction, even if no one's said it yet. Maybe we'll think a bit later why people, or maybe next week, why that view hasn't been embraced. But at least in theory, the groundwork for that position exists. Right? You just need to make a few assumptions. You need to assume that seeing over Zoom counts as seeing. You need to assume that seeing alone is sufficient for making a minyan, and there's no extra condition of being on the same ground or being connected to each other. And right, if you ask, well, what about the Rishus HaRabim, the public domain separates us? That's not really true. I mean, I don't know. I'll speak for myself. I'm currently on the 3rd floor of a building. So there's no public domain between me and anyone right now because we're in the air, right? So again, if you accept that view, there's no, I guess if you draw some sort of angle from where I am to where everyone else is, presumably we wouldn't cross the public domain. I don't know. You'd have to do the math on that. But you can get around any of the objections. Public domain, well, we're higher up than that. Do you need to be connected, being on the same ground in the same area? Not necessarily. So at least in theory, that's a view that hasn't been really expressed. But again, the building blocks for it are in place. So that's something worth raising. All right, let's jump back into the sources. Oh, I guess first let's take some questions, and then we'll jump to the sources. I see Jason asked, is that, it's a private question, but I'll read it anyway. Is the 10 Tfachim rule concerning the public domain, does it apply to the opinion of the Rambam, who has a more expansive definition? Yeah, I think it applies to all the opinions. The Rambam's view is more about Eruv, But I think, as far as I understand, there are explicit Gemaras that talk about 10 Tvachim or higher not being Rosh Hashanah. Okay, any other questions before we go forward? Okay, so let's jump back to the share screen. And again, we saw sort of the summary, some of the main views on this issue. But it's worth also looking at a couple of the particulars. This is Moshe Sternbach. He was really the main, he was the first basically to come out and support Porch Minyanim very early on. This letter is from the 8th of Nisan, but I think before he wrote it up, he was advising many Minyanim to do this in practice already from the early days of the lockdown in Israel. And he's the one who makes the point that he says that if you're on a right, there's no problem of a path, of a road, even a public road, separating between you if you're more than 10 tvachim in the air. People don't walk there, it's not the public domain, and it therefore doesn't separate. So if you're up in the air and you can see someone, it doesn't matter what's in between, it's fine because it's not a Rosh Hashanah. Fine. Okay, so he made that point early on. Again, he was talking largely to people in apartment buildings who were trying to make minyanim on porches. So this actually was very relevant. It's not a theoretical case. I'm sure there are many cases where you had people on two sides of a street who were trying to come up with their minyan. So that was one thing. Here we'll look at a couple of dissenting views that did not like this idea of porch minyanim. Here's Rav Schechter wrote a letter. He actually said that the Mishnah Berurah, we saw the Mishnah Berurah last week, who seems to say that having a minyan where you don't have 10 in the same place, you have people can see each other, that's sufficient. Rav Schechter says actually the Mishnah Berurah contradicts himself in different places, and it's not clear what his own view is. And from the Gemara, it seems like you need actually 10 in the same place. So he just doesn't like this opinion of the Mishnah Berurah. Again, it's a big dispute, it's a big machlokas, not clear how to resolve it. The Mishnah Berurah seems to allow for it, but if you reread the Mishnah Berurah and disagree, Rav Schechter himself came out against having porch minyanim or the like, or minyanim where people can just see each other and not be in person. So obviously, anyone with that view would reject the idea of the more creative ideas that I was raising before. Also, Rav Yitzchak Yosef, the chief rabbi, the Sephardic chief rabbi of Israel, had a letter about joining a minyan. He got into some of the details. He said, according to the majority of Sephardic poskim, Sephardic decisors, you actually don't rely on the opinion that seeing each other is enough. So he was another one of the minority views that said you shouldn't do porch minyanim, you shouldn't do a minyan based on just seeing each other unless you have 10 in the same place. But what he did say, he was very lenient in terms of saying, in terms of answering amen and things like that over the phone or over Zoom. So he says, he thinks, he says, what he suggested was everyone should, apparently in Israel, every day, even in the height of Corona, there was still a minyan at the kosel. So he said everyone every day should call into the kosel. They had some phone number you call in, and you can say amen to their brachos, and you can participate in their minyan over the phone. What about the fact we saw this earlier that there's something disgusting in the way, feces or idols or whatever? He says, even so, there's no problem with saying amen, even if there's something disgusting along the way. That shouldn't stop you from saying amen. So his view was everyone, try to join on the phone a live minyan, right? Either minyan at the kosel or I think they're also in the Corona hotels. People would get sick, they go to the hotel. They're all sick anyway, so they could congregate. They're not going to make each other sick more. So they have minyanim to call into that minyan, etc. So that was his view, that he rejects this idea of roin elu es elu, but he accepted the idea of saying amen over the phone. We'll get to amen in a few more minutes. Okay, so this is all Orthodox, poskim Orthodox decisors. What was interesting is this came up in May. In the conservative movement, they had a lengthy decision of their Committee on Jewish Law and Standards about streaming services on Shabbat and Yom Tov. They allowed, and this was sort of looking forward to the Yom Noraim, the High Holy Days. They said, how are we going to do the High Holy Days if people are not going to shul? And they said, okay, we're going to allow for having High Holidays streamed over Zoom or whatever platforms to people at home. Obviously, inside Orthodox circles, this wasn't done. But in the conservative movement, this was sort of the decision made, and the overwhelming majority of conservative synagogues did this. So part of their decision is the following. They discuss our issue. May one fulfill one's obligation to pray by hearing or responding to prayers transmitted electronically. So fine, first they talk about if you hear a minyan over the phone or something else, then you can say amen. That's fine. And there's a question about using electricity on Shabbos. We'll get to that in a bit. But then here's the this previous decision, this Reisner approach, is that a minyan of at least 10 must be constituted in person, and then others may participate remotely. You have your minyan in person, and then you can join in, but you need 10 in person. While the preference is for two-way connection, fine, you have to be able to hear, fine. Even though but now the question is, can you do it if you don't have a group together in person, which during the pandemic would be harder to do? So he says as follows: a few members of the Committee on Jewish Law and Standards have offered temporary guidance that allows for more lenient approaches during a time of global pandemic when gathering 10 together in one place is unsafe and or illegal. This hora'at sha'ah, right, a temporary injunction, a temporary permission, which was not accepted by the majority. So this was rejected by the conservative Jewish Law and Standards, but it's a minority position that said as follows: suggests the possibility of constituting a minyan via a multi-way visual and audio connection, such that at least 10 participants can see and hear each other. This is exactly what we were talking about before, right? Doing it over Zoom, where you have 10, you have a quorum, they can all see and hear each other, and that might count over Zoom. As a result, this approach requires a video conferencing solution rather than a one-way streaming. This hora'at sha'ah permission to constitute a minyan entirely via video link, based on previous precedent from an earlier plague situation, would not apply under circumstances other than quarantine. In the footnote, they mentioned that the Chidah, we didn't discuss this last time, but actually the Mishnah Berurah is based in some ways on the Chidah. All the different poskim, Prima Gadim cites the Chidah, then Mishnah Berurah cites it, that they would have one group of Jews in one house, another group in a different house. They could see each other, and they made a minyan together. This is the lenient position of the Mishnah Berurah, and so they want to extend that to virtual seeing. So this is what was suggested before. As was mentioned, you need to make a bunch of assumptions, a bunch of halachic assumptions in order for this to work. But I think there's also something else here. It sounds like the majority view, even of the conservative, Jewish law and standards group, rejected this. So the question is, what's the reason why no one has made this argument, or no authoritative group has made this argument to say we should have minyan via over Zoom, or the minyan itself forms over Zoom, even though a plausible argument can be made for it. Again, no one's made it yet, so it's not really on the books. It's not really a valid thing. Again, this minority group says in the conservative movement that one can do it temporarily given the pandemic, one can do it, but even that group isn't willing to say it generally. So why do people think it is that people are avoiding making that argument of if you see each other, that counts for minyan. Seeing over Zoom counts as seeing. We're set. We're golden. Any of the problems that you can raise, you can get around. Why has no one made that argument? Too radical a shift in practice. Okay, John, that could be part of it. Right? There's a few reasons. I'd say, one possibility is just people disagree with some of the assumptions. Right? Either you think that seeing doesn't really work, or you think that seeing over Zoom doesn't count as seeing, or maybe you have objections to the public domain or whatever. That one possibility is just that everyone has some objection on the technical grounds. Or it could be something, something broader, as John said, too radical in practice. Well, what exactly does that mean? Right? What does it mean? What's too radical about it?
Just that, people have been basing their communities around physical shuls for so long, culturally and otherwise. So it could just be too radical of a shift there.
Okay, right. You could just say it's too different. Jews have always been in person, done minyan in person whenever possible. So okay, for a few months, for maybe a year, you can't be in person, but that doesn't mean that we should cancel, or it's harder, whatever it is, doesn't mean we should cancel the whole idea of being in person, right? It's too different to allow for, to cancel that requirement. We should stay too radical in practice, right? I think that's could very well be part of it. I think also there's a slight twist that one could say in addition. Jason, why don't you, yeah. I can't hear you. So, yeah, so I think you could sort of add a twist to it, and maybe Jason's typing this as we speak. But I think once you go to virtual minyan, it's going to be very hard to go back. No one would show up at shul. Okay, exactly, right? It's very hard to go back, meaning let's say you said, okay, it's not ideal, but it can work to make a minyan over Zoom. So then why would anyone ever go to shul? There's no, from a technical halachic perspective, if you took that view, there's no value added, right? There's no nothing, you get nothing additional. You can have your minyan over Zoom without going to shul. And why would anyone go back? Why would anyone go to shul during a pandemic, not during a pandemic at all? Right. So I think that may be part of it too. And I think there may be other things, but it might just be, I think, at some level, the logic gets a little crazy. I mean, I was trying to push for this because it's a new, interesting idea, but the idea that, let's think of the logic here, right? The classic idea of minyan is 10 in a room, a whole quorum in a room. You can extend that to roim elus elu, right? We saw last week, you see someone through a window, you see someone at a distance, but you're still proximate to one another. So now the fact that seeing can be extended because we have video conferencing, therefore we should allow for people across the earth davening together. Like at some point it gets too crazy. The idea, and maybe this is what some of the opinions before were saying, although not technically what they're saying, but the broader idea that there has to be some connection between the people. The idea of minyan, there should be some connection among the group. So the connection can either be everyone's in a room, or even if you're not in a room, you see each other, you're close enough. But if the seeing is now distant, totally distant too, maybe just like it just doesn't make sense at some point. It's conceptually not reasonable. Even if if you put each assumption together, it would work. Maybe there's some broader concept here that the whole point of minyan is presence. But that's exactly what we were saying. Presence. We're not actually present, arguably, together in one Zoom room. It's not the same as actually being in a room, just phenomenologically. We're not all present together. We don't have a minyan. And you might put this in theological terms. God's presence, the Shekhinah, only dwells on a minyan. And the idea of the Shekhinah dwelling over Zoom, what does that even mean? I understand what it means for the Shekhinah to dwell in a physical place. I mean, maybe I don't. That's a theological problem, right? But the Torah talks about God's presence dwelling in the Mikdash, and Yechezkel talks about the Shekhinah leaving from the Mikdash to Chutz La'aretz, etc. There's precedent for that. What does it mean for the divine presence to dwell on a group of people who are totally distant from one another but happen to be able to see each other on Zoom? God's dwelling on Zoom. What does that even mean? Right? It almost sounds like the Matrix or something. I don't know. So at some point you might say that a theological argument like that would complicate things. Again, we haven't gotten to the point where people are writing about this and proposing this in practice, other than this conservative minority position. It hasn't really hit larger, beyond that, it hasn't hit halachic literature. But I wouldn't be surprised if, as the years go ahead, and maybe, I don't know, maybe video conferencing becomes more normalized and more things happen virtually. I wouldn't be surprised if it's a question that people raise in the future. And I don't know how it's going to turn out. Again, I think there is an argument to be made to allow it, but there's also many reasons to push back. So that was my trying to be a little provocative here, to put some arguments out that would maybe justify having a virtual minyan. I don't see it happening anytime soon, but it's worth at least thinking about that possibility. All right, any questions on that? And then we'll finish up some of the sources. Maybe we don't understand what exactly electronic connectedness means, Judy types. Or what does it mean having a street between us? What does that mean? Right? I mean, of course, physically, each of us, there can be a street in theory, but of course, that's not the way it works. Right? We're not seeing each other because of physical proximity. We're seeing each other because of a server and whatnot. Yeah.
Okay, I don't think you're understanding me. I'm saying that electronic connectedness is a concept that we have not yet really internalized. You can't talk about a street or feces being in the way between you and me, because our voices and our images are not, there's nothing between us. They're going through, radiating out there. And we don't know how to deal with that, which is one of the reasons the issue of the microphone has been so not able to be solved, because we don't really understand, or don't want to understand, what electricity really is. And once you do mechanically, it may not be a halachic issue. We have not yet publicly absorbed these ways of being connected. I just want to mention one quick thing.
Sure.
When I was working many years ago, and they first invented the fax machine, and I had never seen one before. And they're telling me that you put a piece of paper in here, and it comes out at the other person's office. And I'm trying to picture this piece of paper going into a wire and coming out at the other phone, because I had no conceptual background for how this transmission could possibly take place. So I'm just saying to you that some of it is that conceptually, we don't know how to handle this. And so we stick to issues that are ancient and traditional and try to force to apply them to what's not really happening.
Okay, great. I think that's a great way of putting it, Judy. That we have like there's a paradigm shift of sorts, meaning the seeing and the hearing over Zoom is just fundamentally different, and presence is fundamentally different than that of other contexts. And we're trying to use old halachic categories and all other or facts categories or paper category, whatever it is, and it just doesn't fit. And there's a problem here, and there's a gap, and we're trying to do the best we can to figure it out. I think that's a great way of putting it, and maybe this is something that we'll develop intuitions about as the years develop, and maybe as our intuitions change, the way that these categories are evaluated will change. Who knows? We'll have to see. Stay tuned. But I think it's a great way of putting it. Let's jump back to the sources, and we'll get into a couple of other issues along these fascinating questions. So in terms of saying Kaddish, we saw in terms of answering Kaddish, even people who think that it doesn't really count as a minyan, you can still, if you hear a minyan talking, you hear a minyan saying Kaddish, you can still say Amen. But what about forming a minyan for Kaddish over Zoom? Now, why would that be any different than forming a minyan for anything else? Article by Rabbi Seth Winberg. We're not going to read it inside, but essentially the idea is based on Elazar Melamed, a posek in Israel, who essentially said, look, people who are in Avelos, people who are saying Kaddish, they really feel a need to say Kaddish. If you say Kaddish when it's not warranted, what did you do wrong? It's not so bad. Worst case, you say Kaddish without a minyan, it's not a bracha levatal. You're not saying God's name in vain. You're saying, you're blessing God in a way that's usually done with a minyan. There's nothing terribly wrong with it. And therefore, you might as well allow people to say Kaddish over a minyan so that they can feel like they're representing their deceased relatives and giving them the honor of saying Kaddish for them, even though halachically it probably doesn't mean anything, but it doesn't hurt either. So you might as well say Kaddish. This is what Rav Melamed suggested, and groups both in America and Israel adopted that suggestion. What does that tell us about presence? Absolutely nothing, because the argument isn't that it qualifies as a minyan. The argument is that despite it not qualifying as a minyan, you can do it anyway. It doesn't really tell us much. Rav Melamed has a bit more of a complex view. We're not going to look into it now because we don't have time. But what we are going to do is jump to our last issue, the definition of sight, hearing, seeing, hearing, and writing. And last time we talked about that in the context of testifying about the new moon, where we saw the idea of if you see a reflection of the moon, does that count or not? And we asked, is that a question of verifying that you saw it properly, or is that a question of you actually need to see it for real? And seeing a reflection doesn't count. That was a whole question. We talked about hearing Megillah over a microphone. We looked at different shuvos for Shlomo Zalman Auerbach or Moshe Feinstein. This came up this year. It's really big news. Rav Schechter of YU came out. This was relatively early. Do we have the date? We don't have the date. But this was a week or two before Purim, before everyone was locked down, when it was just, the things were just starting. He said, he says generally, lechatchila, preferably one shouldn't hear the Megillah over Zoom. He quotes from Moshe Feinstein that we saw last time. He says, in a b'diavad situation, we don't have a choice. Megillah is just a rabbanan, it's only rabbinic, it's permitted. Why? Because according to Moshe Feinstein, probably hearing over the phone or over Zoom or over whatever other indirect means live. If it's live and you're hearing it over technology, it probably counts as hearing. Don't rely on that for biblical mitzvos, but for a d'Rabbanan like Purim, you can rely on it. So this is what he said. If there's a pikuach nefesh consideration caused by coronavirus, it's permissible to hear Mikra Megillah via a live phone call or video. Okay, so that was one thing. That was really the first psak of all the psakim, as far as I can tell. The first COVID psak that really started things going was this psak. I remember the day it came out. Really made waves and of course led to hundreds and thousands of psakim made by different rabbis in the months ahead. Then we had the issue of, so now we're going to talk about a different category, prohibitions over Zoom, using Zoom on Shabbos and Yom Tov, different prohibitions that come up. Of course, generally the standard halachic view is that electricity is prohibited to use on Shabbos and Yom Tov. But we're not going to talk about that. That's a whole other question. This came up with the Zoom Seder. A group of Moroccan rabbis suggested that people have a Zoom Seder. Their view is that electricity is actually permitted on Yom Tov. They had some ways to minimize even the electricity use. There's a lot of pushback because most people think electricity is not allowed on Shabbos. But leaving all that aside, Rav Shechter mentioned an additional factor that comes up as well. He said, if you leave your phone on Yom Tov, it's not really so bad. If you leave your phone on and you talk into your phone and the other person hears you, it's not clear what exactly you're violating. It might be something like, there are abundance, something. It's not exactly clear what you're violating. So on Yom Tov, to leave your phone on and talk to an elderly relative who needs the moral support, he said, or really is not, might not be well if they don't talk to people for a few days and they're not seeing anyone in person, he allowed that. But then he says, however, internet leaving your internet on, having a Zoom Seder or the like, there's a potential issue of violating the prohibition against writing. Leaving your Zoom on is potentially writing. This is based, as far as I recall, on the Rav, on Rabbi Soloveitchik, for Schechter's Rebbe. The kasher ome bifnei amara with muso neres b'mara ein kan ksiva kan ela reflection be'alma. If I don't have Zoom on, I just have my computer's camera app on, and I look into my camera app, I can see my reflection there. You're not doing anything. You're just looking at your reflection. If I'm sitting here and you're sitting there and you can see my face, what I'm doing is I'm projecting an image to you. That is a form of writing, or roshem, at least. If it's not technically writing, it's projecting an image, which is prohibited on Shabbos, right? You can't project an image. It's a subcategory of writing. So even if I have my computer on before Shabbos, but I walk around and you can see what I'm doing, I'm projecting the image of myself to you. I am effectively writing. It's a tolda of ksiva, and it's roshem, and therefore it's prohibited. So Rav Shechter said, if you want to be on the phone with your elderly relatives who really need someone, need to be able to talk to someone and can't see anyone in person because of the pandemic, by all means leave your phone on in that case. But you shouldn't, unless there's a direct threat to someone's life, you shouldn't leave Zoom on, because that's an issue of roshem. So it's a fascinating idea. Does projecting an image actually count as or does seeing or writing or projecting images count? Rav Shechter says actually yes. In terms of the prohibition on Shabbos, not necessarily the electricity thing, that's a side issue. That may or may not be a problem in this case, but the idea of projecting an image actually does count. Fascinating. Elsewhere, this is Rabbi Zaviva Richman and Ethan Tucker of Hadar. They had also had a letter about using video technology in Yom Tov, also before Pesach. It was the hot topic then in the wake of this Zoom Seder tshuva. So they talk about various forbidden activities involved in using Zoom other than electricity, and they talk about writing, the potential prohibition of writing, either chatting in the sidebar on Zoom, right, chatting on Zoom, or recording a call, or making an effort to have one's face be seen. This third one is what Rav Shechter was talking about. All of these, they say, might qualify as writing. And they also talk about hashmas kol, making your voice heard at a distance. This usually, like, one shouldn't have loud sounds happening in their house. Like some people say, you shouldn't leave your laundry machine on in your house if people can hear it outside the house. It's making a ton of noise. Or you shouldn't have, you shouldn't leave your lawnmower running, whatever it is, hashmas kol. You shouldn't project sounds to a distance. So they say maybe it's hashmas kol to speak over your microphone to people elsewhere. That's against the mood of Shabbos or Yom Tov. But I think in both those cases, they're showing that they're taking the idea of both seeing and hearing over Zoom as real. Even though you're only virtually seeing, you're only virtually hearing, they're worried about prohibitions that generally apply to actual seeing and hearing, right? Because they're treating this projection of images that we're all doing to each other right now as actual seeing, at least for the purposes of having be prohibited here. And they're having the projection of sound actually count as hashmas kol. It's projecting a real sound, that would be prohibited. So it's not only mitzvahs, it's not only things like, can you hear the Megillah over Zoom? Can you fulfill a mitzvah through hearing virtually? But there also are prohibitions over virtual hearing and virtual seeing as well. I'll just think we'll close with this. Some thoughts I had in the wake of all of these Zoom Seder and related tshuvos, and the way I see it, it seems like there's two ways of how to look at virtual reality from the perspective of halacha, what I called a realist and a formalist view. So what's happening right now when we're talking to each other over Zoom and looking at each other? We see each other, we hear each other. What exactly is happening? Do you say, I am a formalist? Formally speaking, what's happening is I am making sounds. They're entering my computer. They're translated into whatever data. You know, they go to some server somewhere. They bounce back to each of your computers. That's what's happening. So all that's being transmitted is, you know, electric waves of some sort or electric data. But I'm not actually talking to you, and you're not actually seeing me. If I type in the chat, you're not actually reading my words. You know, I'm typing here, and then, or I'm not even, or it's not even writing, it's just on the computer screen. The data then gets sent. So, you know, in terms of formally speaking, right, I'm not using a quill, and you're not hearing my actual sound waves. You're not seeing my actual, you know, visual waves, my light waves. You're seeing something else, and it has nothing to do with me. There's no real connection here, if you want to be a formalist. On the other hand, I think the realist view is, come on, that's not what really is happening. What's really happening is I'm talking and you're hearing me, and I'm moving around and you're seeing me. That's what's happening in a more real sense. And I think, you know, the views we just saw, at least in these cases, are taking the realist view. Like, don't bother me with the question of where the sound waves are going, and that's not what's actually happening. But if we think about this phenomenologically, and this gets at some of these questions before, but if we think about phenomenologically, I'm talking, you're hearing me. It's the same as if we're in the same room. Maybe it's slightly different. Maybe it's a bit more, I don't know, awkward or more detached, but essentially it's the same thing. I'm talking, you're hearing me. This is speech. I'm talking to you. I have images, you can see them. It's just like we're in the same room and you can see me. And those views would take these, you know, these phenomena as important and what I call the realist view. On the other hand, others who disagree would say, no, you're not seeing me, you're not hearing me. It's totally unrelated. I'm talking, my computer sends stuff. What's happening is electricity. A lot of electricity is happening. So whatever you think about electricity on Shabbos or Yom Tov would come into play. But what's not happening is you're not hearing me and you're not seeing me. And I think that's a very important question that ties into a lot of these issues, including, as was mentioned, the suggestion about minyan, right? That if you need to see each other and seeing is both, you do see each other over Zoom and seeing is sufficient to constitute a minyan. So here we could question that assumption, right? That's assuming that we actually are seeing each other right now. Are we? I don't know. That depends on this issue, right? That depends that you're not, the actual light waves that are reflecting of me are not the ones that you're seeing. You're seeing some reconstituted image in your computer. In any event, so I think what we've seen is all four of these issues. The question of, you know, can we verify what's on the other side of the screen? Do we have that same human emotional connection? Do we have presence together? And are we actually seeing, hearing each other, writing to each other? All of these questions have come up to one degree or another in recent months. There's been a lot of halachic writing about it, some new ideas, and I think the future, as things progress, as our world continues changing, I think we're going to see more and more discussion about these issues. I think we're going to develop new intuitions about them, and you know, it's hard to predict where things are going to go, but I think this is a very important issue to follow. It looks like there are a couple of questions. We'll take the questions and then we'll close. Let's see. How prevalent was Zoom conferencing when Moshe Feinstein was alive? I think there was very little. I think there was like closed circuit TVs and that sort of thing, but the real Zoom, obviously Zoom, the company, didn't exist. There's very little. Moshe Feinstein was talking about talking over the phone, hearing Megillah over the phone and that sort of thing. So Moshe did. I don't think Moshe talks about video conferencing, or he talked about TV, right? Rabbi Yosef talks about seeing someone on TV, which is one directional. Moshe Feinstein talked about phone, which is actually two directional in terms of hearing a Megillah. Other questions should not apply not only to Yisurim, it would be a reason to have a minyan over Zoom, says Judy. Of course, that potentially. You need to make a few assumptions and there may be objections. And Naftali says, does Rav Shechter have a particular basis? We're saying emotional excitement is less over Zoom. He's extrapolating from personal experience, seems subjective. So I don't know if you were here last week, Naftali. We saw Rabbi Yosef quoted a bunch of people who sort of played this out. He himself had some intuitions that others did. But I mean, it's hard to, you know, so there are precedents for this idea that the experience you have in person is not the same as the experience you have virtually. Rav Shechter, I assume, is, you know, building on those intuitions and translating it. But I think very much in line with what we saw there. I think he quoted Rav Ovadia, although we saw a different piece of Rav Ovadia. But he was quoting Rav Ovadia that you don't get as excited about TV, seeing over TV, as you do in person. In terms of, or you talked about that in terms of the trees. We saw it last week in terms of saying a Shechianu on seeing your friend for the first time, which is where we also saw Rav Ovadia talks about it. So it's not too crazy of an extrapolation, and it seems to be intuitively true for most people. There may be exceptions. And then you'd have a question of if 99% of people experience in-person interaction differently than virtual interaction. What about for the 1% who don't feel a difference and or maybe prefer the virtual interaction? Do they make a bracha even though they're sort of the outlier? That's the whole question about how Allah would deal with that. But yeah, it's a fair question. Any other questions before we close?
Can people hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we can hear you now.
Okay.
I mean, that's sort of a philosophical issue, so I'm not sure.
You would categorize Rav Schachter's sock that it's usher to go on Zoom on Yontif because of Roshem as a formalist position. Is that correct?
No, actually not. Actually, I would say that's a realist position, because the way his analysis, the way he discusses it, he doesn't say the fact that I'm moving and you see what's going on matters. For him, it's not the fact that it's on a computer. It's the fact that it's on a computer at a distance that makes it be Roshem, which is fascinating, right? Because it sounded like, if you read him closely, if you just put on the camera app on your computer or on your phone and that doesn't count. That's just like looking at a reflection. But if it sends it somewhere else, then it's Roshem. And what's the distinction there? If you're thinking formalistically, it's the same computer, the same electronic data is happening. The only difference is phenomenological. The experience of me and the person seeing me is different if I'm projecting an image at a distance or not. And I think the only way to understand that is in a realist perspective, as if you're actually projecting yourself to others, that's different than projecting yourself in your own screen. So I think he's not a formalist on this one. Yeah. Any other questions?
Are there any other? Well, I know Machon Adar seems to take more of a, as I understand their philosophy, and I don't understand it fully, that they like often take more of a realist position on many issues. Like, are there other Orthodox poskim who are consistently taking realist positions that you're noticing a trend on?
So I don't know if we can say consistently. There's not that much data to work with. We only have a few months worth of data. What I have noticed, and I think I'm trying to remember if I mentioned this in the article, is that the three people who I saw, or the three groups who I saw, who were offering realist views of seeing, hearing, etc., who were Israel Schechter, the Hadar Tshuva, and also Rabbi Yissaschar Katz of Chove. Haredi poskim, even though Haredi poskim generally did not make this argument. And what's interesting is, of course, this is a chumrah, right? So a stringency that people, let's say, centrist Orthodox, modern Orthodox, and Egal are taking the stringent position. The Haredim are taking the lenient position, but it makes sense because it's the question of realism versus formalism. And the Haredi poskim seems to be more formalist about technology, and the more modern-oriented poskim and writers seem to be more realist. So I think there's not enough data points to say for sure, but it seems like that's the trend, at least on this one, this limited set of issues. Okay, so thank you all. Next week, we're going to move away from halacha and talk about hashkafa, about Jewish theology, different broader questions and concerns that might face us in a world that's becoming increasingly virtual. But Evie's going to share some other upcoming events through Drisha.
Thank you, Rabbi Zuckier. This was a great second class in this series. I'm looking forward to next week's final class on Monday evening. And thank you also to everyone who joined us today on Zoom, on Drisha Live, and on Facebook. We continue our full program tomorrow, Tuesday at 1 p.m. with the third part of a 4-part series, Living and Dying with Dignity, Themes in Halakha and Medical Decision-Making with Rabbi Reifman. In addition, we always have many classes going on. You can find out more information as well as the registration links on our website at www.drisha.org/classes or watch live at www.drisha.org/live. Thank you again for this opportunity to learn with you, Rabbi Zuckier. And again, thank you to everyone who attended. We hope to see you soon at one of our classes here at Drisha. And see you next Monday.
Happy Hanukkah, everyone.
Happy Hanukkah, Chag Sameach.